But this whole sermon series, what I'm trying to do is something a little different. We get caught up in the busyness of the season far too often. And I don't know about you, but there are times in my life when I feel like it's just chaos. Anybody here relate? I will have no chaos as of 4 o'clock today. But it does. It seems like sometimes we get overwhelmed with trying to do all the productions and all the things. And so as I was looking for ideas for Advent, I found this series, or this book actually, by James Moore called Finding Bethlehem in the Midst of Bedlam. And I thought, I lived there a lot, in the midst of Bedlam, trying to figure out where in the world I am. Well, last week we spoke about Advent as marking the beginning. This is the beginning of the Christian year. And what do we know about Advent? It's a season of expectation, right? We know that every Christmas that Jesus has already been born, but we go through this season right now looking for and striving for finding that newness once again. That anticipation of what it means for the Christ child. We go through the sense of mystery, of the what ifs and what will happen when it comes. We live in the both known and the unknown in the season. So the text I want to read with you today, if you'd like to grab a Bible and join me, is from Galatians, New Testament, just in case you don't know. Galatians, y'all relax. Galatians chapter 5. It is a small book in the New Testament. It's easy to overlook it. But I'm going to start with Galatians chapter 5. I'm going to read you 2 verses. Well, 3 verses. I don't count well. Beginning with verse 13. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up into this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you're always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another. These are God's words for God's people. Thanks be to God. You probably expected to hear a text from one of the prophets about the coming Messiah. You may have thought you were going to hear a text or a voice from one of the Gospels, but why in the world are we listening to Paul today? Well, perhaps it's because we need to be reminded about the why of God. Why was it necessary for God to become incarnate, to come and live among us? Why did it need to be that way? Why did God need to be in person to give us one more chance? Why? I want to share a story with you by James Moore. It's called The Parable of the Locksmith. And maybe if we hear this, maybe it'll help us think a little differently. A locksmith broke into the prison. And he found a group of slaves that were living there, and they had been in prison for so long that they thought that they were free. In fact, they decided that they were free, and that everybody who lived outside the wall was actually the ones in prison. Often they could hear cries of pain and anguish muffled from beyond the walls. And once a few of the prisoners escaped, but they quickly came back because they said they were out there wandering in the wilderness for years, and they found that it was difficult. They had to fight for their homes. They had to fight for their lives. There were problems with the government. There was cruelty of war, and there were all kinds of anxieties going on outside the walls. So they came back to prison where it was calm and secure, where things were much more peaceful and much more predictable. Life was easier here, they said. Prison was supposed to make life harder. So they decided that they must not be in prison. The people outside are the prisoners, not us. Then one day a young locksmith came over the wall, and he told the prisoners that they were slaves, that they were the prisoners, not the people on the outside. But then he did something even worse. He broke all the locks to all the gates. And he pushed the doors open, and then all of a sudden the prisoners on the inside could hear the calls that were no longer muffled. They were loud calls from the outside world saying, they could hear the pain. They could hear the need. And he told them, you're free. You should go into the world and you should live as a free person. And some of the prisoners believed the locksmith, and they went out into the world around them. And then some of them said, you know what? I'm going to stay right here. They decided that the locksmith was a social menace. They decided that for the good of the community, he needed to be silenced. For the good of the community, they declared him a troublemaker, and they held a quick trial. And they declared him that troublemaker, and they accused him of disturbing the peace. And then they executed him. They said he was guilty. They executed him, and they decided that they had fought him and won. The trouble was over. But the locksmith had followers. And these followers had stayed very quiet during the trial. And they decided that those broken locks could never be locked again. And so they decided to spread the news of the freedom. They decided to spread the news, the good news that the locksmith had shared with them. And some were killed. Many were persecuted. But this was the thing. They kept on preaching. They kept on sharing the good news. However, some that were still within the walls kept believing and dreaming that they were free. They didn't want to hear the news because they didn't want to be challenged by the pain they saw outside the walls. They didn't want to see or hear the cries for help. They continued to believe it was the people outside who had the problems. And they couldn't understand why the locksmith would break the doors and leave them open. It's a weird parable, isn't it? And yet sometimes I think what we need to do is we need to hear these parables from a new and a different way. We need to understand what we were called to do every day. This season of Advent is supposed to be about hope, love, joy, and peace. It's supposed to be about those things. But every day when we walk around, and we saw it on the news this week, it was about hatred and jealousy, selfishness, pride, anger, complacency, apathy, closed-mindedness. It's hard. People still misunderstand the meaning of freedom and salvation. Jesus Christ is not content to let us stay and live in limited, frail lives. You see, he sees not only are we human and live as human, but we should also be humane. And there are some things that this church is doing and participating in that right now live into that. Every month we go to Our Daily Bread and we provide some food to people who are homeless, and a smile and a little conversation. And when they go back, they're going to be buying socks. They're going to be giving out socks to folks. You may have noticed the little numbering system out in the gathering space, because people in this church are concerned that there are children who won't have Christmas. And through the good work of members of our church, we're going to make certain that that happens. We do good stuff. And Christ is calling us to do even more. Oh no, you say. But this is the thing. When we live lives as Christ has called us to, we become more than we ever dreamed possible. Jesus Christ disturbed a lot of people in his life. And I'm afraid that far too often we have sanitized the gospel into something that is convenient and tidy and fits our sensibilities. But if we go back and we read the gospel and we understand the context of the time, we understand that Jesus Christ shook everything up, especially the church. He said, y'all got a little comfortable. And he says, let's open these doors. Let's go outside the church. Let's find ways to share the message of love and freedom and compassion and forgiveness and peace and reconciliation. Remember those words from Paul I just read? Love your neighbor as yourself. And we heard Jesus repeat them in the Gospels. But these words go all the way back to the New Testament. They're not new. They are what God has been about throughout his creation. But the kind of love that Jesus said that we are supposed to live out often disturbs people. A sense of justice bothers folks. You know, Jesus bothered a lot of folks. Herod got a little upset when he heard he was coming, didn't he? Y'all can laugh a little. I know this is heavy. But he got a little upset, right? And then, of course, we know that Pilate was disturbed when he had to encounter Jesus face to face. He even disturbed his own disciples. These are the people who walked with him every day, because he was so open and his invitation was to so many. You see, Christ is the one who comforts the broken hearts. He's the one who frees us to live in new and different ways. Ways that we never dreamed possible. In John 13:34, it says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. St. Francis of Assisi took that commandment and wrote this poem about it. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console. To be understood as to understand. To be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, and pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And that dying is not just our physical bodies, but when we die to our selfish ways and embrace and embody the love of Christ, we live differently. You see, Christ frees us from a prison of selfishness and a prison of hate. Anybody here know somebody who's been carrying a grudge for a while? I do. You know, hate not only hurts others, the person that it hurts the most is ourselves. It destroys our souls. We become so bitter, we're unable to see the beauty because we're hanging onto our anger. It burns a hot coal of resentment within us until we've lost our perspective or reason, and we can't see beyond the rage. Now you're saying, Kathy, that's crazy. Nobody would do that. Oh yeah, they would. I wish I could tell you how many times I've served for 20 years now. How many people have come up to me and talked about family members and said, you know, I haven't spoken to my sister or my brother or my mother or my father for 5, 10, 20 years. And I said, what happened? And they said, I don't remember. But I got to keep the bitterness going. I know I'm angry about something and therefore I will stay angry. Yo, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to carry that kind of rage and anger and bitterness around in your soul. And it makes you so small. Let it go. Let it go. There's a story, there's a Greek legend about two athletes who were running a race. And two hometown athletes, and they came in first and second, and everybody was so excited and cheering for especially the number one athlete. So they were so excited that they resurrected a statue of him in the middle of town. Well, guess what it did to number 2? Made him a little angry. So every night, he was so angry, he would go out and he would chisel a little bit of that statue away. Every night. Just a chip here and there, just to get rid of it. Until one night when he struck the final blow, the statue came down and crushed him. You see, he literally died from the weight of his anger and his envy. It is not worth it. Envy literally means to boil within. This is not a season to be doing that stuff. This is to be a season where we really work toward forgiveness. And we work toward building bridges. And we work toward saying, you know what? Whatever was, was. Let's be now. And the other thing that happens when the doors are open to the prison of our lives is that we are free from a prison of unconcern. We're free from looking inward, and instead we look out. And all of a sudden we see things that maybe we really would not like to see. We can no longer look around past those that are struggling. It's hard. And I will say, living here in Athens, I've seen more homelessness, more visible. I don't think that there was any less homelessness in some of the other places where I have lived, but I think it's more visible here. At every traffic light, there's somebody holding a sign, right? You walk through town, there are people sitting on the benches. It's hard to look past all that. And we train ourselves, oh, I can't look at that, I can't look at that. It's too difficult. And yet, we're called to do more. And as a church, I know we are already doing, like I told you earlier, some amazing things, but we can be even more creative about what we do and how we do. You ever get overwhelmed walking around all that stuff? I do.
Yeah.
I really do. And sometimes I look at the need that's out there, and I struggle. I truly struggle. I look around and going like, well, what can I do? You know, I've got $20, I can give it away. Is that going to make a difference? There was a young boy who was walking on a beach. The high tide had washed in, and the starfish were all laying there on the beach, dying in the sun. Thousands of starfish as far as the eye could see. And an old man was watching the young boy, and he'd see the young boy would walk up to a starfish. Oops, sorry. He would pick it up, and he would fling it. My sound effects hit the wrong time, didn't it? But he would fling it back into the ocean. He would take another couple steps, he'd pick up another starfish, and he would fling it back into the ocean. And he continued to do this over and over and over. And finally the old man couldn't stand it anymore, and he walked up to the boy and he said, "Son, what are you doing? Don't you see there are thousands and thousands of starfish out here?" And the boy said, "But if I take this one and I throw him back into the ocean, he will live. But if I leave him out here, he will die." And the old man says, "You can never complete this job." And the boy looked down, he picked up a starfish and he looked at it. He said, "But I can make a difference in this one." And threw him back into the ocean. I think too often we allow ourselves to get overwhelmed with the enormity of the problem instead of saying, "God, lead me to whom you want me to make